Hey, folks, coming up on Roland Martin Unfiltered for Monday, December 3rd, 2018. The 41st President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, has died. His body right now is in the U.S. Capitol after arriving a little bit earlier here in Washington, D.C. We will talk with the only African-American cabinet member he had, Louis Sullivan, who served as Secretary of Health and Human Services, about the legacy of George H.W. Bush. Also on today's show, voter fraud targeting black voters in North Carolina by the Republicans. That could actually lead to a new election, a congressional race. We'll talk with the leader of the North Carolina State Democratic Party right here on Roland Martin Unfiltered. Also, drama in Michigan and Wisconsin as Republicans there want to roll back the results of the election, weakening winning ballot measures and trying to take power from incoming Democratic statewide officials like the governor and attorney general. I thought they cared about local control. Also, a good black man with a gun killed by police in Alabama mall laid to rest. Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. gave the eulogy over the weekend for EJ Bradford. Also, the results of an independent autopsy on his body. We'll tell you about it. Also, the domestic violence back in the news in the NFL. Two players. One, of course, Reuben Foster, arrested for domestic violence, signed by the Washington Redskins. Kareem Hunt, who played for the Kansas City Chiefs, after a videotape came out showing him swinging on and kicking a woman. He is off of the team. He's apologizing. We also talked with a Morgan State University professor who says that men can be rehabilitated from domestic violence. And Judge Jeanine Pirro of Fox News, talk about being stuck on stupid. She actually said racism in America ended after the Civil War. Has she actually read a history book? I can't wait for my commentary on that one, folks. It's time to bring the funk on Roland Martin Unfiltered. Let's go.
He's got it. Whatever the miss, he's on it. Whatever it is, he's got the scoop, the fact, the find. And when it breaks, he's right on time and it's rolling. Best believe he's knowing. Putting it down from sports to news to politics. With entertainment just for kicks, he's rolling. It's on Go Roll Roll, y'all. It's Roland Martin, yeah. Rolling with Roland now. He's funk, he's fresh, he's real, the best, you know he's Roland Martin now. Martin.
Folks, the body of President George H.W. Bush is lying right now in state in the U.S. Capitol, where, of course, the state funeral for the president has already started. In terms of there will be 3 days of events taking place beginning today. Again, his body was flown from Houston, Texas, where he died late Friday night. His body was flown, of course, to Washington, D.C. on the plane that he flew on when he was president. Of course, we know it as Air Force One. That plane was dispatched to pick him up. And, of course, tributes have been flowing in all across the country and the world for George H.W. Bush, former member of Congress, former head of the CIA as well. And, of course, he is the father also of another president. That is, of course, George W. Bush, and also the former governor of Florida, Jeb Bush. All those family members were on the plane as well when it flew into Washington, D.C. A ceremony took place there at Andrews Air Force Base when the body came off of the plane. And they also, of course, had a ceremony just outside of the U.S. Capitol where, of course, members of Congress received the body. Again, the president will lie in state before the body is returned to Houston for burial at Texas A&M University. That's where the Bush School is actually located. And so when they opened that university, my alma mater, which is one of the reasons why I'm wearing the shirt today, they actually already designated where President George H.W. Bush and his wife Barbara Bush, who died 8 months ago, where they will be buried. Their bodies will be buried right there on the campus of Texas A&M University. Joining us right now to talk about, of course, President George H.W. Bush, his legacy, and we'll also get into with our panel his black legacy, is Dr. Louis Sullivan. He is the former Secretary of Health and Human Services who served under President George H.W. Bush. Secretary Sullivan, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Roland, and how are you?
Glad to talk with you, sir, my fellow Alpha brother. Also joining us is Armstrong Williams, syndicated columnist, host of the Armstrong Williams Show, who worked in the EEOC under Clarence Thomas during the Bush administration. Armstrong, how you doing?
Hello, Roland.
I want to start with you, Secretary Sullivan. You served under the president for all 4 years. Just your immediate thoughts on his legacy as president of the United States.
We've lost a great leader, a very compassionate person, someone whose accomplishments I think we appreciate even more today than during the time that he was president. He believed in people. He took an interest in everyone. There was no one that he did not treat with dignity and respect. And I consider myself honored to have known and worked with President Bush.
When you think about, again, how he carried himself as president, someone who served as the head of the Republican Party, led the CIA, former member of Congress, many people talked about his statesman-like stature, of course, leading us through the war there in Iraq as well. Huge approval numbers. That is in stark contrast, frankly, to the occupant of the Oval Office right now. And many people have talked about, again, missing that sort of leadership coming out of the Oval Office.
Well, he was really someone who would work with everyone, whether you were Democrat, Republican, or independent, as long as you agreed on working to get an end result. Many of his accomplishments have not really gotten the attention that they should, because, of course, we did have things like the Gulf War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Empire. But domestically, one of his major achievements was the American with Disabilities Act that has really made possible for all members of our society who have various disabilities to participate more fully in everyday life. When I became secretary, we had an AIDS panic in the country. This virus was new, having been discovered in the early 1980s. We didn't have a therapy for that. This condition had not received adequate attention from the federal government. I met with President Bush, and he put into his budget in the spring of 1989 $4.2 billion to be used for AIDS research, treatment, education, screening, and counseling. That changed the face of this disease from a fatal disease to now a chronic condition, where people, rather than living a year or two before dying, they are living 10, 20 years, because we now have more than 30 drugs effective against this virus. We know that people, the stigma that was associated with this has been diminished tremendously. So those are simply a couple of achievements. I'll mention one other thing. When he asked me to serve as secretary, I said to him, I'd be honored, but among my goals would be to increase the diversity and the color in that department, because it doesn't have enough diversity. He said, Lou, I support you in that, and I think that was a great thing. As a result of his support, I was able to appoint the first minority surgeon general and female, Antonio Novello, Hispanic, the first black Social Security Commissioner, Gwendolyn King, the first administrator of the Healthcare Financing Administration, now known as CMS, with Medicare and Medicaid agencies, the first woman to head NIH as director, Bernadine Healy. So he was very supportive of all of those things. So those and many other things about this man I admire, and he worked to support everyone.
Armstrong Williams, your thoughts and reflections on President George H.W. Bush.
Roland, former President Bush always wanted to be known as the education president. Many people forget about that. There was a time in his life when he was a school teacher. So he has very strong feelings about education. And I think sometimes what people forget, it was a time particularly when minority inner city schools did not feel they were getting the same resources as these private elite and sometimes public schools. And the first debate about school choice and choice in education came about during the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush, where he felt that these schools and these students in these inner cities should also have access to the same facilities, the same kind of teachers that can give them the best shot at getting the best education and become a contributing citizen to society. So George Bush had a profound impact on education, particularly in inner city and minority communities. I don't know if you remember his Charlottesville Symposium, which was a game changer, because in that Charlottesville Symposium, what he was able to do was bring about accountability and standards that teachers had to earn their reputation. They had to earn their promotions at the time, and they had to produce results for the students. And so what they did, they put in some very strict criteria for in the areas of math and English, and even in the area of reading. And later on, when former President Bill Clinton took over, he continued that tradition of education and many of the policies that he instituted, which also 8 years later, which led to his son, when he was elected president of the United States, George H. Walker Bush's son, George, was No Child Left Behind, and furthering his father's commitment to education. The other legacy that sometimes we forget about, were it not for George Herbert Walker Bush, there would be no African American on the Supreme Court today. None of us could ever forget that bitter fight of Justice Thomas, who was then chairman of the EEOC and then was a circuit judge of the Dixie Court of Appeals, being nominated by then President George Herbert Walker Bush to be his nominee for the Supreme Court. And for someone who worked for Mr. Thomas at the time, who was behind the scenes, I'll never forget when a lot of these senators, Republicans, were getting very weak, and they thought the nomination was becoming very controversial. They asked that the president, he should withdraw his nomination because it was becoming too damaging for the Republican Party and some of the gains that they were trying to achieve at that time. And I'll never forget when Judge Thomas received a call from President Bush during the Oval Office in the middle of his confirmation hearings when he took a break. And I'll never forget, he was almost in tears. He said, "I just heard from the president." And President Bush said, "I don't care what anybody says, Clarence, I'm with you. I nominated you. I believe in loyalty. You have been loyal to me, and I have a fiduciary responsibility to you, and I will be with you until the bitter end. Don't you think about quitting. You hang in there because this is not right, and I'm with you." And what people don't realize, that was the energy and the inspiration that Justice Thomas carried with him in the evening of that confirmation hearings that gave him the ability and the backbone and the courage to fight on. And so no matter what people may think about Justice Thomas's views or his historical position on the Supreme Court, George Bush stood by Justice Thomas. It's the reason why today we have the only African American on the Supreme Court.
Secretary Sullivan, final comments from you.
Well, I would like to simply add to Armstrong's comments about President Bush's commitment to education. Many people are not aware of the fact that George Herbert Walker Bush's mother, Dorothy Walker, was one of the founding directors of the United Negro College Fund. And secondly, back in the 40s, up until a few years ago, there was always a member of the Bush family on the board of the UNCF. And as an undergraduate at Yale, George Bush headed up the student UNCF drive. He knew George Trent. They were friends, and that was another expression. I met George Bush when he spoke at the dedication of our first building at the Morehouse School of Medicine in July of 1982. And he then invited me to accompany him to Africa on a 2-week trip to 8 countries in November of that year. And on that trip was Barbara Bush. I recruited her to serve on the board of trustees of Morehouse School of Medicine, and she served for 6 years, missed only one meeting during that time. George Bush spoke at the inauguration of Ben Payton in October of '81 as the new president of Tuskegee, and he's spoken at a number of black colleges. So those are the kinds of things that really, I think, spoke to his character and his commitment, and indeed, I was honored to know him and his wife, Barbara, and the members of his family.
Secretary Sullivan, we appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Armstrong Weavers, we appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, we're going to go to my panel right now. Joining us, of course, Michael Brown, former vice chair of the DNC Finance Committee, Eugene Craig, CEO of the Eugene Craig Organization. Michael, start with you. When, of course, George H.W. Bush was in office, your father, work he did with the DNC, opposing a lot of those various things. One of the things that happens when a president dies, whether they're Republican or Democrat, you have laudatory views of people. Also, in the case of George H.W. Bush, he was 94 years old. But you also, as they say, there's one story, then there's the whole story. Your perspective in terms of how we should remember his presidency overall, but specifically when it comes to African Americans.
Well, first of all, to his family and to his public service, certainly thoughts and prayers. But I remember a time, and it's a difficult situation because clearly you want to mourn the passing of the former president. But we also have to remember some other things that occurred. And as a young advanced man for Michael Dukakis, when he was running for president, there was the polls were very close at the time. And then there was that racist ad that popped up with Willie Horton. And whether it was the party, whether it was Roger Ailes, whoever did it.
Lee Atwater, of course, who's the campaign manager.
You got to assume the candidate approved of that ad. And when you approve of that ad, yes, I heard the other nice things he clearly may or may not have done during his presidency. But to become president, he ran an extremely racist ad that turned the race around, and clearly he became president and beat Michael Dukakis.
Eugene.
I was born during the middle of Bush's term, so everything I know about him is either via history, via read, or what's being interpreted now. But if I can make a contrast of the president that Bush 41 was and the president we have today, man, we've come a long way. I mean, man, we've come a very long way. Responsible for the American Disabilities Act, key player in the Fair Housing Act, going against the wishes of some of his big dollar donors and whatnot. But if I could say, if we, look into 2020, could look for a model of what a president should be, even, with disagreements, handling, an opposition party in Congress. I would much rather live through a President, Bush 41 than the current Trump times we have right now.
Avis Armstrong talked about, obviously, the appointment of Clarence Thomas. That was a huge issue there. Many people accused President George Bush of, on one hand, saying he didn't believe in quotas, but then appointing Clarence Thomas there based upon the quotas. He'd only been on the appeals court for 15 months. This was his first time ever as a judge. And many said he simply did not have the stature to replace a legend like Thurgood Marshall. And so your perspective on the presidency of George Bush, specifically as it relates to black folks.
Absolutely. Now, with that case in particular, I remember Thurgood Marshall. I'm a little bit older than you, Eugene. I remember Thurgood Marshall's final press conference when he was about to step down from the court. And he said something during that press conference that was actually very prophetic. He said that in terms of whether or not the person who replaced him, if that person should be white or black, he specifically said you can have a black snake just as easily as you can have a white snake. And unfortunately, it's my belief that with the Clarence Thomas selection, it was a black snake that was elected, that was appointed to replace the amazing icon that was a Thurgood Marshall. So unfortunately, that's a very disappointing legacy for me in terms of George Bush.
When we also look at, Michael, you talked about the Willie Horton ad. That was a huge issue. And of course, his campaign manager was Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater, after Bush won, Bush made him head of the Republican National Committee. Then with tapes were later discovered where he talked about in terms of how you use race in campaigns. You could no longer say the N-word. You couldn't say things along those lines, but you could use other phrases that were speaking in essence in code. And you said, look, candidate had to be aware of that. And that's also the reality. That's also a part of the legacy of George H.W. Bush. Also, I think when we look at in terms of policies, he was following 8 years of Ronald Reagan. Again, I think certainly a different type of Republican that was clearly different than what you see today. Some will say he was not as hardcore as a Ronald Reagan that led a little bit differently than Reagan.
Absolutely. And to Secretary Sullivan's points, and I just found it interesting. And again, it's hard to criticize when we're also mourning our former president. However, I found it interesting that the secretary mentioned he had to call to get permission to hire black folks. I mean, why don't you just hire the best people? And the best people happen to be people of color. Great. The fact that he had to make a phone call, do you mind if I hire some black folks? What's that? What is that? So clearly there was an environment where he thought, well, I can't hire some black folks. I better call and get some permission first. That is also part of the legacy.
See, for me, I don't see it as, and I think that this is part of the problem. I don't see it as criticizing. No, the bottom line is if you're talking about a person's legacy, then there is the good, the bad, and the ugly. There are things that other people will say, well, you really shouldn't bring those things up. There should not be a whitewashing of somebody's history because the reality is it happened. He did appoint Clarence Thomas. That was a contentious issue that we still deal with today when it comes to Supreme Court hearings. In terms of how we run campaign ads, that actually existed as well. Also, Eugene, in terms of how the people of Haiti were treated under President George H.W. Bush. I mean, all of these things are part of a president's legacy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Lee Atwater doesn't become head of the RNC by magic. I mean, sitting president has full reign and pick of who he wants to lead the party and who wants to chair the party, and more importantly, especially when that former president was once a chair of the party themselves. But the legacy of Bush 41 is probably going to be, although he was a one-term president, probably going to be more fuller than most of our political leaders that we've had. I mean, someone that served in the House of Representatives, served as our, head of the CIA, served as head of the RNC, vice president and president. I think probably I'll say this, I think one of the issues that people kind of brush up against with his legacy is that he's been a major shaper of our international policy from the roles that he's played rather than our domestic policy, which people can feel and, affect, it's something that you feel is tangible. The Berlin Wall comes down, that's something that's, who rah-rah, but, it doesn't necessarily something that Americans can feel.
Right. You also have, of course, the case of Keith Jackson, the young man who was lured to the White House to sell crack, and it took a whole lot to make that happen. President Bush wanted to be able to state in his speech that you can buy crack outside of the White House, when reality is nobody was selling crack outside the White House. Look at the news reports when that young man was being interviewed, Keith Jackson. Even though he lived here, he didn't even know where the White House was located. And then he finally said, "Oh, you mean the place where Reagan lives?" And it was a whole lot that took place just to get him to come to sell these drugs to an undercover cop. Then he gets hit with a significant prison sentence. That legacy is also a part of that of George H.W. Bush, because they went through all of that so he could be able to hold up a bag of crack to say this was purchased outside. And so people talk about Bill Clinton and mass incarceration, but if you look, Bill Clinton came after George H.W. Bush. There were significant sentences that were being handed down in federal courts when it came to drugs, because we dealt with crack in the early 80s. Bush was president again for 88 to 92.
Yep.
And that man lost 10 years of his life because of being ensnarled. Exactly, in terms of his time, in terms of being snarled in that entrapment campaign, basically, just for political purposes. So it's definitely not a bright spot on that presidency. But I will say also, in terms of the broader context, you mentioned if we compare him to our current president, Lord, anything looks better than that. But I would also say, just looking in terms of our drug policy, if you compare, where we were then with the war on drugs, and particularly with the just overly verbose incarceration efforts around crack cocaine, as compared with all of a sudden seeing our current sort of crisis around drugs being a health problem, and it's primarily impacted the white community. It's a completely night and day reaction.
Yeah, so I mean, I would just hope that, first of all, it's interesting. I wonder when it comes to all these other networks, how many black folks have they been calling? Because there were African Americans who did serve. And granted, Secretary Sullivan was the only African American cabinet member. We also reached out to Fred McClure. Fred McClure, he was the first black student body president at Texas A&M University, served as special assistant to President George H.W. Bush. He's been involved in the planning of the state funeral, and so hopefully we'll get him on tomorrow or Wednesday. But also Judy Smith, who, of course, folks know from Scandal. She served in the Bush administration as well, and so we also look to talk to Michael Williams, who served in the Bush administration. Also another African American from Texas who served in housing and urban development. So hopefully we'll be talking to those folks over the next 2 days. Let's now talk about Republicans in North Carolina. They spend lots of time yelling and screaming, talking about the issue of voter fraud. Guess what? We now have an example of voter fraud involving the Republicans. There seemed to be an actual voter fraud, again, in a congressional district in North Carolina with absentee ballots. It's so suspicious. The state will not certify the results until a hearing later this month, and they are going to actually televise. The winner so far is the Republican with less than 1,000 vote margin, about 905 votes. The state GOP, they are pressuring the state election board to certify the results. The board says, hell no, that is not going to happen. Joining us right now is Doug Wilson, Deputy Executive Director of the North Carolina Democratic Party. So, Doug, we hear Republicans love talking about voter fraud in your state, but are they kind of silent on this one?
Thank you for having me, Roland. Yes, the Republicans are trying to push the board to certify the election quickly. We are saying, the Democratic Party, that this needs to be investigated thoroughly, and the voters need to be heard. This is a good example of election tampering, and these same Republicans are trying to push for voter ID and try to push for other pieces of legislation to suppress the vote. And this is an example of where we believe there needs to be an investigation. Clearly, something has gone on, and we want the voters to be heard.
So exactly what is it? So talk about this whole idea of harvesting. And so what are folks suggesting that ballots were thrown away, they were not turned in? So exactly what's the issue?
Yeah, and that's trying to find out. There have been voters who have turned in affidavits to the local board of election, state board of election, who said that there was an individual who came to their house and said that I'm here to collect your absentee ballot. And they claimed to be from the Harris campaign. Well, not Harris campaign, but it claimed to be from the local board of elections. And they collected these affidavits, or they collected these ballots, and nobody knows where those ballots went. And so that's what we're trying to find out now. That's what the investigation is trying to find out now.
So you have individuals who said that I filled out an absentee ballot, but it wasn't turned in. Also, I've read some stories where people said the ballots were not placed in sealed envelopes.
Yes, that's correct. And so if you look at the data across the district, the Democrat Dan McCready did well with absentee ballots in all the other counties, for exception of Bladen County. And the reason why there was some concern in Bladen County is that Republicans only make up a certain percentage of the vote there, but yet the Republican Mark Harris had a higher absentee ballot percentage among voters. And so that is where the Board of Election noticed that there was something strange going on there.
All right, then. Well, we certainly will pay attention to see what happens in North Carolina, how Republicans are, the games that they're playing there. I doubt very seriously we'll see Donald Trump tweeting about voter fraud by Republicans in North Carolina. Doug Wilson, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Folks, we also have drama taking place in Michigan where voters passed big proposals by big numbers to the issue of voting. First and foremost, folks can register to vote up to Election Day. And then, of course, the GOP, they want to change that. They want to move it to 14 days before the election. Okay, but I thought the voters picked. Also, motor voter automatic registration. The GOP wants to pass a bill that will require a citizenship designation on driver's licenses before registration. They also are trying to weaken the new state nonpartisan commission that will cover districts. Okay, so let me explain something. The voters passed a referendum that will create a nonpartisan commission to draw lines. Now the Republicans in this lame duck session want to weaken the very referendum the voters passed. They also, a Democrat won in Michigan. They want to weaken what the Democratic governor can do. Now let's go to Wisconsin. Same thing. Republicans today moved very quickly with a rare lame duck session that would make sweeping changes to the duties of the Democratic elected governor and the Democratically elected attorney general. It would shift the power to the GOP controlled legislature. Okay, let me help y'all out. So the governor currently has power. They would then say, oh, no, we're going to take the power from you, the governor, and give it to the legislature. So Tony Evers, the incoming Democratic governor, can have the power, and also the incoming Democratic Attorney General, Josh Call, can have the power. They also want to cut early voting. Why? Because they lost in early voting. It gets better. They also want to move an election. Let me help you out. They want to switch an election. Right now, there's a 4-3 majority, Republicans, on the Supreme Court. Well, one person is coming up for election in 2020. They want to separate that person from the ballot because they know there's going to be a large turnout in 2020. Go to our panel. I mean, when you talk about, this is what I keep telling people. You know, guys like Brandon could come on here and yell and scream about Democrats in Maryland all day. But I keep saying, you cannot show me where Democrats pull this kind of nonsense controlling the state legislature.
You can't. I mean, there's no equivalent in either state. You know, what's going on in Michigan is appalling. What's going on in Wisconsin is appalling, especially given the recent history of Wisconsin. You know, where the Democrat members fled the state and they were willing to send the Wisconsin State police after them to pull them back and make them come back and cast votes. And I mean, my issue with a lot of these current GOP state parties and a lot of these elected officials is this. If you give voters a reason to vote for you, they will vote for you. Mm-hmm. If you give voters a reason to make them feel like they have a home with you, they'll give you their vote. Yeah. I mean, the thing is this, you don't have to scam, to cheat, to steal, to win or keep power if you give voters a reason to vote for you. Instead of focusing on backdoor ways to control from a minority, figure out ways to build a new majority. When it comes to Michigan, Gina Barr, who's now the director of African American engagement at the RNC, is running for Michigan party chair there. I'd love to see her weigh in on this.
Mm-hmm. That ain't gonna happen.
Yeah, I need to weigh in on this.
I mean, but Michael, when you see this, first of all, the incoming Attorney General has talked about the whole issue of Medicaid. There's a lawsuit as well, and so his whole deal is, we're going to sue over it. We're going to take the power from you. They literally are going to want to take the power, and pretty much have Attorney General and the governor who does nothing. Pretty much. I mean, I'm talking about stripping them of significant amounts of their power, just because they lost at the ballot box.
And this fight's going to go on for quite some time, which means the governor and the attorney general will not have power for quite some time, because this is going to be wrapped up in the courts for a minute. And clearly it could get up to the Supreme Court. So it'll be interesting to see, because obviously in the future and other situations where people lose and they have sour grapes and they want to take retribution, they're going to see what happens in court to see if they can do this to other parties. And I mean, this is the bottom of the barrel of civility. Crazy.
And it was. I have long said that when you look at the games that they're playing, that it's all based upon what Republicans did in North Carolina.
Absolutely.
They studied North Carolina. They've been doing this crap for the past 6 years.
Absolutely.
And they've been watching what they have done and like, oh, that's a good idea. We're gonna weaken that law. I mean, and then in Michigan, to completely act as if the voters did not actually pass the referendum. I mean, they fought to get it on the ballot. Yeah. They got the signatures. It gets on the ballot. Then they said, no, we're going to come back and we're going to weaken it. It's the same thing Republicans did, I think it was in Montana, where the voters passed a strict ethics deal, and they came back and literally gutted the very ethics bill that was passed by the voters.
See, this is where you have the intentional destruction of democracy. If elected officials are taking it upon themselves to completely disregard the will of the people who have actually gone through the process. I mean, it's not easy to get something on the ballot and to pass it. Okay, you have to go through petitions. I mean, it takes a lot of effort to do that. And if people have organized to the degree that's necessary to pass a referendum, just to have it undermined by basically lame duck people who are in there for a couple of months so that they can sort of redirect the will of the people for their own political game, how is it that anyone would trust in democracy moving forward?
I mean, folks, I'll tell you, so in 2020, in Wisconsin, the presidential primary is going to be in March. They want to move, they literally want to move, not the primary, this one race. So you always hear Republicans talking about being fiscally prudent. They want to have 2 elections in 2 months. Have the Democratic primary in March,
and then April,
and then have this election for this judicial seat in April.
Of course.
You know, the question is, where's Paul Ryan on this? You know, where's
Where's Paul Ryan? Where's Reince Priebus?
Yeah, where's Reince Priebus? But more importantly, you know, where's Scott Walker on this? Is somebody that went through a recall election, you know, won the will of the voters a whole, you know, 3rd, 4th time or whatnot. Yeah. He should be somebody that's super sensitive to an issue like this. Of hey, you know, once the voters are spoken, the voters are spoken. Yeah. You know, the party should not be trying to strip them. I think, you know, if Scott Walker has any decorum left in him, you know, he should. You know,
that's a big if.
He needs to issue a very quick veto threat. It is a huge if.
If voters in Wisconsin, if they have the recall effort for Scott Walker, I dare say, if any Republican in Wisconsin moves forward and votes on any of these, there should be an immediate recall election for every single one of those Republicans.
I agree 100% with you.
And then in Michigan, whatever the rules there, if they have recall there, do the exact same thing, because this is grossly undemocratic. It is utterly shameful. And again, you're not going to hear jack from national Republicans. You're not going to hear anything. You're not going to hear, and I keep saying this, I would love to see Black Republicans as a group stand up and call out Republicans of what they're doing. And you know what? You're not going to see it. So, Brandon, guys like you, Candace Owens, whatever you are, Malik. I can go down the line. I would love to see. I mean, Eugene, I would love to see your buddies.
Listen,
stand up as a group, not come on this show as an individual. No, but to literally go have a news conference at the Republican National Committee.
I'll be the one to tell you, you know, they'll dance around. I'll be the one to tell you, they're not going to do it. They're scared. They're not, you know, they're scared that they'll lose access to the White House. They're scared the RNC won't invite them to nice things. I mean, they're terrified of it. You know, they feel as though they have to play the game and stay quiet, you know, to get what they want. I'll play straight with you, Roland. I can't lie to you. I'm not going to lie.
Guts.
I'm not going to lie to the viewers.
No guts. That's what I call it. No guts. So, love to see you do it. Holler at a brother when you do it. Going to a break right now. We come back, we'll talk about EJ Bradford. He was buried over the weekend. Reverend Jackson gave a moving sermon for his eulogy. All of that next. Roland Martin Unfiltered. Just do the... Folks, normally on Monday, I'm rocking the gear of an HBCU, but of course, today with President George H.W. Bush lying in state at the Capitol. That's why I'm wearing my Texas A&M sweater. That's where the Bush School, as well as his presidential library is, and so that's why I'm wearing that. But today's HBCU Giving Day School, Morehouse College, founded in Atlanta, 1867. Of course, prominent graduates include Dr. King, Spike Lee, Samuel L. Jackson, and then, of course, the great Alpha Man, first Black mayor of Atlanta, Maynard Jackson. Folks, if you want to get to Morehouse, go to morehouse.edu. That's morehouse.edu. All right, folks, let's talk about a good guy with a gun who was shot and killed, and the NRA has been real silent. Emantic EJ Fitzgerald Bradford was buried on Saturday in Birmingham. Independent autopsy was done on his body, showing that he was shot 3 times from the back. He was hit in the head, neck, and lower back by bullets fired at him, again, from behind. His father, Emantic Fitzgerald Bradford Sr., a police officer, said this, quote, "My son was murdered by this officer, and that was cowardice. What you have done was destroy my family. There's no justice. If you get off from this, you will not get off with this. I will make sure." As I said, Reverend Jackson gave the eulogy at his funeral, which took place at Boutwell Memorial Auditorium in Birmingham on Saturday. Here's some of that eulogy.
Something about EJ is magic. Even now, EJ speaks to us. As the people we were enslaved for 246 years, we got off the boats at the Alabama River in Montgomery and walked up that hill down Commerce Street, cultivated cotton to make this state and the nation rich. We had the legal status of property. We were access to other folks' enrichment. When slavery ended and with the new right to vote, we were considered threats. The promise of democracy was met with lynch mobs and nooses. Former slave masters were emboldened to terrorize us in our communities with bloodhounds, shotguns, and shallow graves. Domestic terrorism was reinforced with the silence of white church people and European theologians. Domestic terrorism found validation in every level of education, K through 16. Here in Alabama, Rosa Parks emerged in 1955, declaring enough is enough, defied the unjust law of racial segregation. Out of the womb of that battle emerged Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I once asked Mrs. Parks why she didn't go to the back of the bus. You could have been beaten, run over by the bus. See, I thought about going to the back, but I heard the voice of Emmett Till speaking to me and I couldn't go back. Emmett Till speaking from the grave. The EJ speaks to us even from the grave. On the soil emerged a bus boycott that set in motion democracy around the world. On the soil, led by Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and Reverend Woods and A.G. Gaston, who housed and fed us in Birmingham. Unarmed children faced water hoses and vicious dogs. On the soil, Dr. King was jailed as white religious leaders challenged his moral authority and his sense of strategy. On this soil, Jim Lee Jackson, a black soldier, was killed in Greene County, Alabama, but that turned into a march from Selma to Montgomery for the right to vote. On this soil. In the lineage of those battles, innocent blood, today EJ joins that great course of witnesses. The list of victims of this sickness of uncontrolled violence, fueled by racism and political indifference, is much too long. In the face of Emantic's unjustified death, we can decide the value of his life. But Emmanuel's name has been omitted in the print media. He was just another black male victim. We know that the name given by our parents means something. Emmanuel Fitzgerald Bradford Jr. is his name. In the heavens, Emantic now holds the throne of those who have died without the benefit of a long life. But this name will not die. His blood will not have been shed in vain. He will live as long as we remember him. And we will not forget him. The officer who took Emantic's life, snuffed out his dream, must face justice. Justice must be a deterrent. It must be demoralizing to enlist to go to fight in Afghanistan, come home and can't survive a shopping center in Hoover, Alabama. We must never adjust to our predicament. We must resist it with action. No one is above the law, not even the president, certainly no police officer above the law. Because his life mattered, we must vote and insist that state's attorneys and state's attorneys general enforce the law. This is the New South, where the Crimson Tide is #1 and millions see Alabama and Auburn play the big game, black and white together. The New South attracts Mercedes-Benz and Honda and Toyota and Nissan. In the New South, we reject uncivilized behavior. In the New South, we made the New South, and it must be new for everybody.
Again, folks, what is amazing about this story is that now we have this independent autopsy being shot in the back. And so what will the officers say? Here's Bradford's dad was a cop. He said there should have been a warning to put down your weapon. He said clearly that wasn't done. I want to go to our panel here. First of all, for this cop, it's going to be. I think this story is going to be a hell of a lot different than the other stories that we've seen, because this is going to be a black cop,
right,
who lost a son.
Yeah.
Who you're going to. So I can't wait to try to see the fraternal order police stand with a cop who killed Bradford.
Yeah.
With one of their own across the courtroom.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see. And plus, this young man was also a man of the military, and so in every way, shape, or form, this is a family that that deserves respect, has served this country, have put their lives on the line for this country. And in a situation like this, this scenario that the NRA keeps saying that we need to have a good guy with the gun when something happens. If that good guy with the gun happens to be black, he ends up dead when the cops arrive on the scene.
We still have not seen or heard if there were body cameras. In talking with the attorneys last week, there supposedly were. We need to see what that looked like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is this, you go back to Avis's point about the NRA, where's Colin Newell in this? Where's Antonia Okafor? Where is, Dana Loesch? Where are the NRA voices that decide that, every time there's a shooting, especially police-involved shooting, when it comes to the defense, and their argument is good guy with a gun.
Yep.
Their argument is, hey, you need, your 2A is your first line of defense. So if that's your argument, then you need to step up here and step up for this family. I mean, you have a gentleman that was, military. You have his dad was a cop. I mean, you have a family that's given their lives to public service and protecting and defending the rights of Alabama, people of the residents of Alabama and citizens of this country. Folk need to step up. But I agree with you. That body camera footage need to be released, need to be released swiftly, and these cops be persecuted.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm wondering to Avis, do you think can police officers be trained psychologically relative to these kind of issues related to race? Related to stigmas, and I mean, is that possible?
Well, it is possible. I mean, there is diversity training. That's part of a little bit of what I do. Actually, do diversity, not to the cops though. Lord have mercy. In corporations, absolutely. So there are trainings that you can do around unconscious bias and the like. However, my challenge is that I don't believe there's any will for these police departments to do that. You have to literally care about black people. And when I see the reaction of what happens when a black person ends up dead, there seems to be zero empathy on behalf of police departments. They just kind of close ranks and do everything they can to subvert the truth rather than open daylight to it. So the bottom line is no institution changes unless it wants to change. And I don't think this institution wants to change.
Well, you talk about closing ranks and covering up. Let's talk about the NFL and domestic violence. Kareem Hunt, who played for the Kansas City Chiefs, star running back, he was cut from the team after a tape became public where he is shown striking a woman. This tape was obtained by TMZ, not only striking her but also kicking her. He was cut by the Kansas City Chiefs because he lied to the team. He lied to the team because it happened earlier this year. He did not give them the full story. They cut him. Now, here's what's the crazy part. In an interview with Lisa Salters with ESPN, he said the NFL hadn't even talked to him. Here's another part of that interview.
You requested this opportunity to talk one-on-one with us. Why?
Honestly, I just want to let the world know, how sorry I am for my actions, and, it's been a tough time for me, and I'm extremely embarrassed because of that video.
Kareem, we've all seen the videos. You've seen the videos. I think it's fair to say that many would say that those images, they speak for themselves. What is there for you to say?
I'm definitely not that type of person, and my mother raised me right. I was raised by my mom and my grandma, and it was just us, and they've always taught me well, and I know right from wrong, and I'm always a person who want to see and make everybody happy.
Has the NFL ever questioned you about that incident?
No, they have not.
Did they ever asked you to talk about that incident?
No, they have not.
Now, again, here's the backstory. They had an away game in Cleveland, which took in February, and then there was something happening in his room. And so there was a woman who was there, 19 years old, who they say became belligerent, and then he simply wanted her out of the room. So Hunt kicked her out of the room, and then that's when things became violent. The woman and Hunt became confrontational. Guys, do you have the video? Okay, all right, then, so we should be able to pull that video up. And again, so they became confrontational with each other. Hunt then, he was trying to be held back by his friends. He kept charging her, and he pushed her. Then later, you can see the video where he is kicking her. Okay, well, I'm still trying to understand this, and I'm looking at my panel here. This is what, again, to me, this is stupid. He says this happens. He didn't know who she was. He just wanted out of her the room. Dude, there's nobody in the room who has more than lose than you.
Oh, God, yes.
2, his friends are trying to hold him back, and he is so crazed and out of his mind, he is throwing them aside to get at her. And I'm sitting there going, dude, what are you doing? What? I mean, it's like, first of all, what the hell are you doing hitting a woman? But she's out of the room. Yeah. Close the damn door. Call the cops and say, yo, it's a crazy white woman outside my door.
It's crazy. I mean, there's no excuse for violence against women. There's absolutely no excuse for it. But the way that this was handled is absolutely disgusting within itself. I mean, I don't the NFL may not have spoken to him, but I also don't think that TMZ almost a year later magically came across the video. But he said but he also said in an interview that the team spoke to him, and the other witnesses that were there and around kind of corroborated his story.
Right, but here's the deal, though. You can have a story. First of all, go to my iPad. This is from TMZ. This is the video they obtained. Okay, so here you have a video where he is sitting here, where he is talking to her. Okay, then he pushes her. It's like, okay, so he throws a friend aside, pushes her a second time. The friend is sitting here, and so guess what? Now it's 3 people. It's 4 people trying to get him back in the room. Again, right here, if you take your ass into the room, it's all good.
Wow.
Then she swings at him, gets pushed down. They are still trying to hold on to him. And I'm going, you're the star running back of the Kansas City Chiefs. You're getting paid millions of dollars. 4 years ago, Ray Rice punches his now wife, and his career over. Alden Smith, career over. Ray McDonald, San Francisco 49ers, domestic violence, career over. What does he then do? While she's down, you about to see him. He's being held back by his friends. He comes, 2 guys are holding him back. What does he do? You're going to see him come in the picture in a second, and you're going to see him kick her. And I'm going, no, it's all this stuff. Well, that's not who I am. That's not who, dude, that is who you are. Yeah. Because not only that, he's been accused of a vicious assault at a nightclub in January, and then also now punching a dude in October. Okay? And so I was discussing this on social media, and I was telling people, I'm like, you're not going to have a career. Now, the Washington Redskins signed Reuben Foster after he was cut by the San Francisco 49ers from an alleged domestic violence incident in his hotel room in Tampa with the woman, his on and off girlfriend, who previously accused him of domestic violence, but then she recanted her testimony. And so the Redskins picked him up, and Doug Williams got into some trouble because he said, hey, we vetted this whole thing, we looked at it, and then he basically said, folks are making small potatoes out of this compared to other people in the high-profile jobs. He had to apologize the next day to his mama, his wife, and his 6 daughters for essentially reducing domestic violence, as something. And one, it's utterly ridiculous to hit another woman. You're not defending yourself, okay? But dude, it's real simple. This is down to that. He was cut Friday. Yeah. Saturday was the 6-year anniversary of the Kansas City linebacker who shot and killed his girlfriend and then killed himself in the parking lot. The Kansas City Chiefs have had to deal with this several other times. This is utterly stupid, and you literally just threw your career away for a 19-year-old person who you said you met that night.
I don't understand how. And clearly, there's no excuse, zero tolerance. You got to walk away.
Yeah.
You just got to turn your back and walk away. I don't even know why he even, you're right, why did he even come out into the hallway in the first place? It's people you don't know. Your boys are telling you to chill.
I'm telling you.
You're not listening to your boys. And then you kick a woman when she's down. I mean, that is just, he may never play again.
And all these people who are saying that she's belligerent, she used the N-word, I don't care.
It doesn't matter.
This is what Rose gonna do. Rose gonna say, you know what? I'm gonna go into the bathroom, lock the door.
The rest of y'all can
I'm gonna get my phone. I'm gonna get my phone.
911.
Yeah.
I got a crazy ass woman in my hotel room. I haven't hit her. I haven't touched her. I don't want to do nothing. Can y'all come right down and get this crazy white woman out my room? I'm in the bathroom. I'll be here when y'all arrive.
That's right.
I am not losing my stuff.
You got to protect yourself.
Absolutely correct.
And the thing is this, I think, and this is a discussion that needs to be had, there are other ways to protect yourself outside of physical violence. You know, there's other ways to protect me.
Yes, I'm gonna call somebody else on her.
But I agree with Roland though. It's not like he needed to protect. That wasn't about him protecting himself.
No,
actually. It was nothing that was done to him to hurt him. A professional.
I'm speaking from a more broader standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what I do think is rich though is folk like Ray Rice and Chris Carter coming out and being the mouthpieces of the NFL and deciding that they.
Well, no, but if you're Ray Rice, first of all, Larry Johnson, of course, who used to play for the Kansas City Chiefs.
Ray Lewis, not Ray Rice.
Larry Johnson.
Ray Lewis.
Well, I don't care.
Yeah.
Larry Johnson, who was a running back for the Kansas City Chiefs, who was convicted of domestic violence. He blew up, said, "Yo, didn't y'all learn from?" He's been very vocal about what he has gone through, but he also believes very strong that he has CTE that's contributed to in terms of these various outbursts. And he was mad as hell at Kareem Hunt, like, "Yo, I talked to y'all and showed you what I've had to go through and what I've lost. Are you crazy?" This again, it was. I just don't understand, this whole deal of. And now it's like, well, that's not how my mama raised me. I'm like, I don't understand how you ain't thinking about that when the person's right in front of you.
Absolutely. I mean, he's trying to do damage control now. It's too little. It's too late. But I don't think he has a career. Period.
But here's the other question though jumps out.
This is NFL still.
Well, that is true. But here's the other question that jumps out because I remember when it happened with Chris Brown and Rihanna. I was at CNN, and so for like 2 weeks, every panel discussion was about domestic violence, but they were all women. And I filled in for Kevin Brown, and I said, and there were producers who were like, what is wrong with you? And I'm going, well, if you're going to discuss domestic violence, you might want to talk to dudes about that, since it's men largely beating women. I don't understand why that was like some kind of revolutionary damn idea. So last week when we were at Morgan State University, we were talking to Dr. Larice Edwards about HIV and AIDS for World AIDS Day, which we ran on Friday. But she also is, of course, the Director of Community Practice and Outreach, and Associate Professor in the Department of Behavioral Health Sciences at Morgan State. Domestic violence was actually her thesis. And so we talked about that. And she says, despite what many other people have said, she says men can be rehabilitated who have committed domestic violence. Here's what she said. Studying behavior, men and women. I mean, how do we deal with, in our community, this issue of domestic violence?
Historically, certain things that happen within families of color, black families, we want to keep it there. But when a person is lethal or in a position to kill or harm somebody, those are the kind of things we need to reach out for help with.
I also think, I remember when the Chris Brown, Rihanna domestic violence incident happened.
Yes.
I was on CNN, and I watched this conversation for 2 or 3 weeks. And so then when I went to fill in for Campbell Brown, I said, I need a panel of all men. They were like, what are you talking about? I said, okay, I've watched this network, and every single night I've seen woman after woman after woman. I said, if you want to deal with domestic violence, I said, you might want to have a conversation with men about men. I just think that, I was talking to folks at Allstate, they have a Purple Purse campaign. They signed Kerry Washington. I said, so what are you doing when it comes to men? And they said, dang, that's a good idea.
Well, the House of Ruth here in Baltimore, they have counseling and a psychoeducational program for men, and that's the program that I worked in. And men were mandated by court to come to the program, but it gave them an opportunity to talk about behaviors their ideas, and they're looking at men and women's roles in the relationship. And I think you can't do this work well and do a good job with it without including men. It's just impossible. So I agree with you. You definitely have to include men in the discourse.
When we obviously see other stories, and as a sister who is very active against anti-violence against women, she is a rape survivor, and others.
Wow.
We've had these conversations, and they've said, sorry, a man cannot be, once he strikes a woman, once he abuses a woman, no, that's who he is for the rest of his life. Can't be reformed, can't be fixed.
I disagree with that.
Explain it.
The reason why I think sometimes violence is a learned behavior. And a lot of times people hurt other people because they've been hurt. And there's a good possibility that a man who inflicts violence on women and violence in general may have had some issues in his past where he was abused. So we can't rule out that they cannot be, for the lack of a better term, reformed or rehabilitated. Because I know men who've come through domestic violence programs very successfully and realized the sources of their anger and their latch out to their intimate partners. So I disagree with that. And I also disagree, you know what people always often say, it's the alcohol or it's the drug that exacerbates the violence. But there are people who are violent, men and women, who don't drink or use any kind of substance. So we can't use that as an excuse anymore either.
How do we, as I don't have any children, but I have nieces and nephews, what do we look for? What should we be correcting when folks, not when they are 18 and 20 in a relationship, but when they are 12 and 14 and 16, what should we be looking at?
We should be looking at things that they share with us about friends and partners. Domestic violence don't start with a hit or a threat. It starts sometimes with just a gesture. So being able to recognize those signs. A lot of times people think, unfortunately, that violence is a sign of love. Well, it's not always that case. And the late, great Maya Angelou said, when people show you who they are, believe them the first time. So it's good to be able to recognize people who want to know where you're going, people who are aggressive, want to keep you all to themselves, trying to keep you away from family and friends, want to know where you are. And social media doesn't help at all these days, because Instagram and Snapchat, and people can get to you when they want to. And there's a lot of domestic violence through technology in terms of stalking people. So we have to be mindful of all of the avenues that play a role in perpetuating violence, particularly domestic violence.
All right, folks. We certainly appreciate Dr. Edwards for that conversation. Okay, y'all. So, y'all know, I ain't watching Fox News. They don't call me, so it ain't like I'm going to watch them. But I saw this on social media. So Jeanine Pirro used to be a judge, district attorney. She got a show on Fox News on the weekends. One, she crazy. But I knew she was crazy until I saw this clip.
If you want to come here, you apply. You do it legally. You're not entitled to come here. You have no right to come here to assault our borders. And it's at our discretion that you do so. And then, if we agree, you get to the back of the line like everyone else. And don't give me this racism nonsense. We fought a civil war to make sure that we put an end to the stain of racism and slavery in our nation. We're not racist. Truth be told, you're engaging in reverse racism. It seems you think that your skin color entitles you to be here ahead of everyone else in the world who may have a different skin color, but who's suffering the same injustice. You're not.
Give me a moment. Did she just say we fought the Civil War to end racism? Did you hear that?
While serving you up grade A.
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, Jeanine Pirro, let me sort of help you out. Okay. Civil War. We know thousands died. the most people have died in a war, most Americans in history. We do know that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued as a way to facilitate the ending of that particular war. We do know that, of course, Reconstruction began in 1865, the period of probably the largest advancement for black people in American history. Arguably, that period lasted about 10 to 12 years. We know that the Reconstruction Amendments were passed, 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. Also, of course, you had the 1860 Civil Rights Act that was also passed. But we also know about the Dred Scott decision that came down during that, after the Civil War. We also are aware of Plessy versus Ferguson, which came by in 1896. Let me also help you out, Janine. Of course, in 1876, that was an election, that was a contested election between a Republican and a Democrat. Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican, was a Democrat. And so they cut a deal. It was called the Great Compromise. And the interesting thing about this deal, Janine, is that the deal was never actually somewhere on paper. It was never voted upon. It was just sort of a handshake deal. And here was the deal. The deal is Hayes, of course, you had Grant, who was the president, Ulysses B. Grant. The deal was if they would withdraw the federal troops from the last 3 remaining southern state capitals, then they would say Hayes can become president, and then we'll hook the Democrats up by withdrawing the federal troops. The Democrats said, look, we're not going to touch the slaves, the free slaves, everybody's all good, we're going to get along with them, but we know they were lying. It's called the Great Compromise of 1877, Janine. And then this was what happened after the Great Compromise of 1877. There was a thing called Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow, Janine, was actually racism. There's a thing called the Black Codes, which came out after the Great Compromise of 1877. We actually saw slavery without shackles in America, Janine. Now, that, of course, in 1877. Last I checked, there were covenants that were actually in place where black people couldn't live next to white people, that black people had land taken from them. It's called racism, Janine. We had a thing called the peonage system, where African Americans were thrown in jail because we were no longer slaves, so therefore they needed free labor in places like Mississippi and Alabama, so they had trumped up charges for black people, and then they were thrown in jail. It's called racism. Then, of course, even when you go to the First World War, Janine, you had a separation of troops. Black troops over here and white troops over here. It's also called racism. And then, of course, you had the black newspapers, like the Double V campaign, victory at home and victory abroad, because they say that we're fighting fascism across the ocean. We kind of want to deal with racism in America. It's still called racism. Then, of course, you might remember, Janine, that movie, The Birth of a Nation, you know, where they showed the Klan. And, of course, D.W. Griffith, it was like this really great movie. That was called racism. You might mean that great bigot, Woodrow Wilson, showed it in the White House. Democrat, absolutely racist, Janine. Then you might also remember that when FDR became, first of all, before FDR, Herbert Hoover became president, and he was a Republican, he led a movement called the Lily White Movement, where the racists in the Republican Party got with the racists in the Democratic Party, and they had a thing called the Lily White Movement. Okay, Janine, it's called the Lily White Movement, which means that I couldn't be in the movement, Eugene couldn't be in the movement, Michael couldn't be in the movement, as Avis couldn't be in the movement because we were black. It's called racism. Then, of course, Janine, you might remember also when FDR became president, he was put on pressure by A. Philip Randolph when it came to the issue of racism. 1936, Jesse Owens wins 4 gold medals in Germany. Hitler wouldn't shake his hand, but guess what? He also wasn't invited to the White House because FDR wouldn't shake his hand. That's called racism. And in fact, I do recall also when Jesse Owens came home, that was a dinner for him in New York City. It was a dinner for him to celebrate him making America look good in Germany. He had to go through the kitchen, even though he was the honoree. It's called racism. Then, of course, we moved, Janine, to the 40s and to the 50s. And August 28th, we moved to the issue of Emmett Till being lynched in Mississippi. Brown versus Board of Education, overturned by the Supreme Court, 9-0 decision by the Supreme Court. Racism. Brown 2 in 1955. Racism. Montgomery bus boycott, December 1st, 1955. Racism. Then, of course, Albany, Georgia. Then North Carolina A&T. Desegregating lunch counters. Then, of course, March on Washington. And, of course, Selma and Birmingham. And then let's see, Charlotte and Atlanta. And let's see, Florida, Jackie Robinson. Of course, he didn't get to Major League Baseball until 1947. Damn, what was that? Racism. Who was the last team to actually hire a black player in baseball? Was it the Red Sox? Who was the last team to hire a black player in football? I think it was called the Redskins. And Major League Baseball had a rule you could only have 3 black people on a team at one time. Damn, Janine, that's called racism. Then, of course, let's see here. Fair Housing Act, 1968. Only reason it got passed because the king got assassinated on April 4th, 1968. It was filibustered for 2 years. What the hell we call that? Racism. What the hell is wrong with you? You're a white woman who went to law school. Matter of fact, let me help you out as a white woman who went to law school. Because guess what? The only reason you were able to go to law school is because of black people. Because when Title IX was passed in 1972, they said that was a provision of the Civil Rights Act. Because you know where Title IX came from? You're a lawyer. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. Please. If you are going to be on television, at least attempt to walk past a book. You don't have to open it up. I just think through osmosis, what's in the book might jump the hell out and knock you upside your head and give you some common sense about American history. So no, Janine, racism in America didn't end because of the Civil War. It continued, and it still continues to this day.
On her network.
I'm done.
That was good. That was good. I would have enjoyed your history class. That was good.
Jesus. I just can't.
That's terrible that she doesn't know
The
that.
scariest
Just
part about
idiotic.
I believe she knows. But she
that
doesn't.
audience, man, that Fox audience eat it up.
Exactly. They don't want to acknowledge it.
Right. So Janine,
She gave
be
us
more than
her
happy.
rant.
Call a brother to come on the show. We can help you. I'll bring some books. I'll bring an Amazon gift card. Okay? I'll help you out. All right, folks, support RolandMartinOnTheFilter.com by going to RolandMartinOnTheFilter.com and to support the show. You can join our Bring the Funk fan club to help us make this possible. Of course, we always are trying to do the right thing. And yes, educating people like Judge Janine Pirro, who is who has a limit when it comes to obviously knowledge in her brain, because it sort of stopped at the Civil War. Okay, so again, support us by also be sure to go to our YouTube channel and subscribe. Also turn on your live notifications as well. Tomorrow's Alpha Day on the show. December 4th is when Alpha Phi Alpha was founded. Sorry, Mike, you little Sigmas. Y'all good, but guess what? Y'all ain't alphas. So, but I don't know what you are, whatever you are, something like that. You want you an Omega? Same thing. Okay. If you ain't alpha, you just behind us. So y'all all the same. Kappas, Iotas, Omegas, Sigmas, they all the same to me. So again, tomorrow's show, we're gonna have Justin Fairfax, Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Alpha Michael. Also, we're gonna have on the show Congressman Bobby Scott of Virginia, talking about education in the new Congress, Alpha Michael. And then of course, we're also gonna have my Reverend Dr. William J. Barber on the show, Alpha Michael. And then, of course, a special word from Lee Saunders. He, of course, is head of the AFS-CMB Labor Union, big supporter of our show, Alpha Michael. And then, of course, we're also going to have on tomorrow's show, great panel. We're going to have, of course, Lon Walls, Greg Carr from Howard University. And, of course, we're also going to have on the show my man, Sam Fullwood from Center for American Progress. All alphas, Michael. And so that's how we roll. So it's going to be a black and gold day tomorrow. I'll see y'all guys later. Hi!